This is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune. In this podcast, we'll talk about the doctrine of Transcendentals from the Middle Ages. We won't, of course, go into academic depth of this problem because it's impossible in a short span of time we have before us, but we'll do something like an introductory discussion of this quote-unquote doctrine. I say quote-unquote because the idea of doctrine sometimes implies that you have some kind of closed system that explains something and that it is a set of statements that are, so to speak, cast in stone. And medieval treatment of transcendentals was nothing of a sort. It was always something that is found in a dynamic inquiry led by some of the great medieval thinkers, and most of the time transcendentals are more like implicit than explicitly treated. Now, this term transcendental may ring some bells even in people who don't know anything about philosophy, let alone medieval philosophy, or better to say medieval Sacra Doctrina, or sacred science of theology. But modern notion of transcendental, of something being transcendental, can get indeed really warped. For instance, some of you may have heard of transcendental meditation, whatever the hell that means, of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, one of those Indian charlatans that made it big in the West. God rest his soul, he died long ago. You have transcendental when some writer from 20th century wants to say that something is mystical or something is beyond the scope of sensual experience. For instance, he would say it is transcendental. Well, this is not, as we will see, this is not really accurate, but accurate modern notion of transcendental, which is inversion of the medieval notion, which is not really founded in medieval thought, is Kant's notion of transcendental. And this Kant's notion, Immanuel Kant's notion, is something that was later developed in most of, if not all, branches of Western philosophy that claimed to be transcendental, that is to say philosophical movements, as for instance phenomenology, or indeed the movement of classical German idealism that was built upon criticism of Kant, but it was a transcendental criticism. So to start from the end of the rope, trying to pull ourselves back to the beginning of the rope, where the rope was initially tied, we'll start with modern and proceed to Middle Ages. Now, just one more caveat. This is not some kind of lecture in history of philosophy. I'm not that that good an expert on medievals, but this will be more like talking about what it means to think and what we can learn from this tradition. We still have some connection to, fortunately, and one of the periods when this tradition with a big T was something that held sway over intellects, at least of educated people, were High Middle Ages. And there we had this doctrine. Namely, Kant came up with an idea of transcendental philosophy. And transcendental philosophy is a synonym for his philosophy, that is theoretical philosophy of his at least, that considers itself with an ontology of cognition or ontology of knowledge. That is to say, the answer to a question, what can I know? One of the three famous Kant's questions, what can I know, what should I do, and what can I hope for? All three questions end up with the question, what is man? This is a very definite modern way of thinking that we find somewhat self-explanatory today, but it is anything but. Anyway, Transcendental philosophy was the philosophy that attempted to analyze entirety of possible human knowledge for Kant. That is to say, transcendental is the principle, that principle can be called transcendental, that can, on the grounds of which we can give account on how object relates to subject in a priori way. Now, this convoluted definition is a paraphrase of even more convoluted definition by Immanuel Kant. Because this is something that he was very good on expounding and applying. That is what he called transcendental philosophy, but he sometimes had trouble in defining these terms because they are very unusual. They require somewhat counterintuitive mental act. What he wants to say with this is that transcendental principle is a principle a priori in the subjective sense. That is to say, when we think transcendental, we think about step back, not step forward. The word transcendent, at least in modern philosophy, is what we would use when we would like to say that there is a God that is above all sensual experience. That would be transcendent, whereas transcendental would be kind of like something that is at least understandable only in making a step back into ourselves, so to speak. This is a somewhat illustrative explanation. Now, how Kant, what Kant means by this? Well, for Kant, the main question is, in what way does the object come to be grasped as real by subject, how this relation is constituted. And Kant's assumption was what he called Copernican turn, is that whereas in common experience we think along the lines that we circle or revolve around objects, that is to say, knowing subject is something that comes to knowable object. Kant wanted to overturn this and said that it is the other way around, that is to say that objects revolve around subjects. In philosophical terms, in ontological terms, objects, that is to say objects of our experience and knowledge, are constituted by principles that are originally principles of consciousness, or, as Kant calls it, the pure mind. In English translation, pure reason, but it's not pure reason. Pure reason is a subsection of mind. This is the difference between Vernunft and Verstand in German. Anyways, there are transcendental principles, for instance, are time and space. They are, better to say, pure or transcendental forms of intuition. This means that time and space for Kant are not qualities of the things in themselves. They are not real in the sense that they could stay real if there was not a knowing subject in this world. This is Kant's way of thinking, and this is a very modern way of thinking. We are very accustomed to think in this way, believe it or not, however strange it may seem to you. The same applies to so-called categories of the pure reason, of reine Verstand. Categories are originally, and we mentioned them on Kali Tribune already a few times, things said, I'm quoting now Aristotle, who first systematized them, things spoken in non-complex manner. That is to say, the modes in which we can give simple accounts and understanding of the simple modes of existence of things and beings in this world. That is to say, categories are how much of something there is, how big something is, in how many numbers it comes, to what is something related, in what intensity it has, what quality it is, in what manner does it exist. Namely, I'm trying to avoid quantity, quality, and so on, because in original Greeks, Roman philosophers, Christian philosophers later, categories were formulated as answers to a question, for instance, pos, poion, how much, or in what manner. That's how Aristotle calls them. And this quantity, quality, and so on, that's something that is added later on in modernity. And Kant distinguished 12 categories as opposed to 10 traditional 10 categories, because he added the categories of logical modality, that is to say possibility, necessity, and so reality. So, when we say transcendental in Kant, we are obliged to understand it as some kind of subjective yet objectively valid principle. Kant would say that this world has transcendental ideality while it has empirical reality. Empirical reality means that it is as real as it gets to us as individuals. But in transcendental sense, in the sense of subjective first principles, it is ideal. It is the constituted by pure forms of reason and pure, that are categories, and the pure intuitions of time and space. In medieval, transcendentals were something completely different, but something that can easily be confused with this by modern people or modern historians of ideas who like to see themselves in previous ages, because it's creating anachronism. It's much easier that way. Namely, transcendentals for people as, for instance, Philip the Chancellor, whom we already mentioned in one of our earlier podcasts that was close to this subject, or Thomas Aquinas, or Bonaventura, or Albert Magnus, Albert the Great. The Transcendentals were something completely different. Transcendentals are usually summed up to be 3 or 4, sometimes 5. The most common are what is called esse, unum, verum, bonum, and sometimes pulchrum, beautiful, or res, the thing. Unum is of course one, esse is being, bonum is good. Now, what are transcendentals? Transcendentals come from the verb transcendere. This means overstepping or stepping further, or let's say overstretching, or walking over the line, crossing something. The reason, the way they were used in this mostly 13th century, when this doctrine came to got some kind of formal recognition, although it was always present but not always explicit. This doctrine of transcendentals. The idea is that transcendentals are the things that transcend categories. So categories are the modes in which being can be known, but there are also modes in which being is contracted. For instance, quality tells us something about being as, let's say, mass, as something that has heaviness, something that can be numbered, in effect of material being. And it contracts being to materiality, in a sense. Something that René Guénon made excellent use of. He was quite ingeniously recognized the possibility that you can, to an extent, observe the history of the modern world in this categorical sense, where everything is subsumed under category, that is to say, contracted under category that bespokes matter, quantity, that is to say, extension and individual number of units. So categories contract being that the main category is substance, or ousia in Greek, that is the answer to a question TST or quod est, what is? The thing that can be explicated in definitions, but being is something that cannot be contracted in definition. It transcends genera, it transcends species, it is ever all present. This fact of being superior fact, in fact, something that transcends categories in the sense of ens communio, what Latins, medievals called the one unified being, and in the sense of God who transcends this also. This is where Transcendentals come from, because the discussion was on the subject of the book on divine names, Divinis Nomibus, by Pseudo Dionysius Areopagite, one of the mysterious fathers of the church, because nobody knows who he really was. Which name of God, or which attribute, or which let us stick to attribute of God that can be spoken of. This is called cataphatic theology, where there are things about God you can say that are not not separate from God, but are not disclosing His essence to you in a full way, of course. This was discussion, for instance, whether good or being is primary, because there is a hierarchy here, and so some said it was good, some say it was being, and so on and so forth. And what came to pass is a realization that those modes are convertible, and transcendentals are convertible notions. They are more than notions, but they are convertible. This means that they bespeak the same nature, that their supposition is the same. For instance, if we say God is good, if we say God is being, we didn't say anything less with one of those terms. Or we took anything or added anything to God. But what we did and what we do with this is that we explicate something for ourselves, that is to say, we go further in our knowledge in a very fundamental way. We resolve something. Now, in one of my previous podcasts, where I touched partly on this subject, we talk about Philip the Chancellor's definition of truth, which I find beautiful. He said, the truth is indivision or undividedness of being and what is. Now, this is built on transcendental. Being and what is, being undivided, tells us that being and what is are, first of all, not the same, but also they are not at all different. They are not divided. Being totally undivided can mean being unified. Now, the thing is that in this definition, he puts the truth as being something, as being the quality, let's put it this way, to use the word category of quality, quality of some particular thing or particular being, of being not divided from its source, because being is a source of beings. The Father is the source of everything. The God, in fact, is source of everything else. And when something is true or truthful, it is such to an extent that it is not divided from him, because this truthfulness is something that is provided by him. Nothing has it of itself. It is something that is bestowed by him upon beings that he created. This is implication of this simple sentence. You have this more specialized definition of truth, when you say that truth is the correspondence of notion and reality. But this is already somewhat restricted definition of truth, somewhat more special definition of truth. This undividedness or indivisibility of being and beings is, I think, more fundamental. And it tells us something about transcendental. So, if being is a transcendental esse, it is transcendental insofar that it is the terminus into which our intellect resolves everything. That is to say, everything we know as being. We cannot know it as non-being. Now, in our day and age, this is not something that people take seriously, and cannot comprehend why people for 2000 years took it so seriously, that there is differentiation between being and things. We can take a look at this from various viewpoints, but I would say that what is most important, why is being transcendental? It can be exchanged with something that is also something that everything can be resolved into. This is, for instance, the good, because everything exists for the good. Now I'm talking from the horizon of Christianity and Christian theology, philosophy, and Christian practice. And also partly from the pagan antiquity and idea of good being the aim of every act, but good in the widest sense of the word. Nobody does things for the evil cause, save a very restricted number of people, in my opinion, but people, even when they do evil, when they do bad, they try to find good excuse for it, which serves only to reinforce this pretty common sense insight that every activity and every process is towards the good. Now, good and being are therefore interchangeable, because they are all encompassing, all present, and they cut through all categories you can think of. Now, for instance, in modernity, when you have this linguistic turn philosophy that claimed, somewhat simplifiedly said, that all the problems of philosophy are in fact maladies of language, that things like saying, for instance, that something has a more being, that man has being, is like saying, for instance, that white thing has more whiteness, or something like that, or that it is nonsensical, therefore, to say that being is more identical than, for instance, being in itself is more identical than being of man, and so on and so forth. And what is interesting here, we have answer here in Transcendentals. You have answer why this is not so, because being, beautiful, true, and other transcendentals are things that apply to all. Whiteness heaviness, and et al., etalia, do not apply to all. So you cannot say that using the word being is simply misusing grammar, like you take from the white, you turn it into whiteness, into this abstract known, and then you create philosophy out of it, hypostasizing whiteness as a principle existing in some intelligible heaven. That's how these modern philosophers, mostly of from Anglo-Saxon part of the world, like to talk about these things. Although they were mostly initiated from Austrian school of philosophy of science, so-called Vienna Circle and Ludwig Wittgenstein. But that's a story in itself. What is interesting is that being, on the other hand, is said of all. You cannot escape being. You cannot say that it is misuse to say that being and something, individual thing, are not the same, because beauty and every individual beautiful thing are the same. They are not really the same. But this difference is very, very peculiar, very subtle difference that is not easily expounded, because this is not so much Platonic way of thinking. You can call it Platonic in a sense of going deeply into Platonism and understanding Transcendentals as some kind of forms. But what is important in them is that they are most general forms, and most general doesn't mean most general concepts, but the most general ways in which the world, the created world, exists, and through which we understand this world as created. Because all transcendentals are convertible one into another, and with converting one into another, they tell us something else, because good tells us something for our notion, tells us something different than being. It tells us, for instance, I'll take a better example, the one, unum, tells us something more than being, although it comes after being, because being is the first thing that can at all pop in the mind. You can't have mind without being. It is the medium in which we think, because you cannot think non-being, you can think only being. And this being in general, being in itself, being ipsum esse, the being itself, comes to us intuitively, whether we think of it or not, as something that has to be there for anything to exist and our thinking to exist. But when we say one, that being is one, we don't add something to being that we predicate to it. We just give our knowledge a further insight or resolution of what being means, because this means that being is undivided. It is all-encompassing, it is everywhere, but it is not divided. And this is what oneness, unum, transcendental of unum, tells us, because it speaks of same nature, but gives us a different ratio or different logos. Now, and this is very interesting, and this has nothing to do with this Kantian way of looking at things, and there were attempts in history of philosophy of trying to understand this as Kantian. It was, for instance, Transcendental Thomism, when they tried to prove that Thomas Aquinas was thinking along the lines of Kant and so on. He most certainly not. These principles are not subjective. And to understand that they are not subjective, you have to have an eye for the things that these medievals presuppose and readily explain, because they consider it naturally. Namely, there is no discrepancy between subject and object. They are not thinking in this way. They don't see a problem there. Subject and object are abstractions that they had completely different meaning. You couldn't think in the way that you are conscious subject that is now making a mental experiment. How do I approach the world? Does the world form itself into the world in accordance to me, or it is the other way around? This is not an issue with them. This is a modern thing. This is something completely, radically different. In the teaching of Transcendental, it is very important to understand in this traditional teaching that things in this world have what is called intentio. Intentio is not intention in the subjective sense. It is a translation of logos. That is to say, what you could also translate as ratio in Latin, the truth of thing, one could say, that makes something what it is. And this intentio, when it is understood, it is expressed in language, and the first it is conceived in notions, this intelligible intention of intentio of what the thing is. It is abstracted from the material thing into concept. But this abstraction, this is a real process. This is not something like making mental experiment. You are obliged, it can be abstracted only in the way it is. It is, a mind is energized by the form of the thing it thinks. And then, and only then, you have words which signify this notion, which then again reflects this reality. So there is no creativity here. There is no idea that words come to things in the sense that you put labels on things. No. Things have their ratios, their intentios, their logoi, and they have to be expressed correctly. And the foundation of correct expression is the correct notion. And the main notions we get from Transcendentals, although Transcendentals are not merely notions, they are principles. So when you think, first act of thinking is the first act of thinking being. And being as such, being as being, is the ultimate beginning and the end of thinking. And therefore, for instance, Thomas Aquinas would say that it is the object, quote-unquote object, not of discursive thinking, of demonstration, resolution, analysis. No, it is the intellect, he calls it intellectus. It is the pure, simple intuition of intellect, on which it subsists. This has to be present. And this applies then to other transcendentals, which are further convertible, for instance, with being. Some philosophers, now I mentioned Thomas Aquinas, the others had maybe other opinions in the details, very important details, we won't go into that, but it is very interesting. I will note only in the end that, for instance, you have in modern philosophy this question of being with Heidegger and so on, and it is astonishing how undercapacitated modern thinkers thinking about this were towards these old masters, because this is the conceptual clarity that today is very rare to be found. And what is interesting in interpretation of these previous traditional philosophers or traditional theologians, wise men, let's call them, because that's what they were, and holy men, there is a lot of anachronisms and I would think misappropriations. But we won't go into modern's bashing, repeat ourselves as a broken record, especially Heidegger bashing. But for those in the know, that they're already aware that Heidegger is the one who is usually tied to this question of being in 20th and 21st century. So this was only introductory, hopefully understandable, graspable inquiry about transcendentals, because this is somewhat arcane subject, not because the problematics is arcane, because transcendentals are ever present. But the problem is, as I said in the beginning, this is one of those teachings that was so common. I would presume that it was very rarely explicitly worked out. They kind of like presume this, and these are most interesting things when you approach tradition. This is the things you look for. This is where most important things lie, in my opinion. And transcendentals were very rarely treated in the history of philosophy that somebody really studied this subject. It is surprisingly a little literature. I would recommend, in the end, the closing of this podcast, Jan Artsen, unfortunately a late Dutch philosopher and expert in Middle Ages, who wrote about this extensively. I've read one of his books on the problem of transcendentals with a special stress on Thomas Aquinas. The book is astonishing work of philosophical scholarship with both excellent philological skills that this gentleman possessed, and his philosophical skills, ability to see these subtle differences and not to fall into pitfalls of modernizing the traditional thought. Anyway, I'll put a note in the show notes about Jan Artsen, so maybe if anybody is interested, there are some of his works even online. They are specialized work, not for everybody. Not everybody would enjoy reading those difficult philosophical inquiries, but who is into this will not be sorry for reading his works. Anyway, hopefully this was informative and not overly long. We are almost 40 minutes in, so let's say it's a closing time. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.